Hello everyone, welcome to the most educational chess speedrun on YouTube, episode 4. My name is Alex and I'm rated just over 2000 ELO, typically on chess.com. And in this series, I'm doing a rating climb probably up to 2000 ELO-ish from 1000 ELO. And during the games, I try to explain my thought process as simply and in depth as I possibly can, and then in the post-game analysis, really dive into some of the finer details of the position. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying this playlist so far. The previous 3 episodes are linked down below. With that being said, let's get into the rapid game. Okay, so we're playing, I'm going to try that, Hadusatasic. Hadusatasic, I really hope that's correct, from France, and he goes for e4, d4, and we're going to play a Caro. I feel like I have to say this every single time, but I have an entire playlist on my channel dedicated to every single game I've played in the Caro defense on the YouTube channel. And we get another advanced variation. I think we had this in I think it was the previous episode. Literally the previous episode. And as I detailed in that episode, bishop to f5 is technically the main line. There are some reasons that I don't like to play it, but mostly because I think that c5 is far more challenging. You might be wondering why on earth I would go c6, right? Oh, okay, there we go. I hate how the thing slides left and right. I don't know why. Why would you go c6 on the first move, and then on the third move go c5? Well, the point is that by playing c6 d5, you disincentivize white from taking, because then you bring your c pawn into the center, and white loses an e pawn, meaning that black has two central pawns and white has one central pawn. Obviously, that's a very simplistic way of putting it. There's many intricacies to the position, and the exchange Caro Kann isn't even necessarily a bad opening for white. But the point is that you incentivize white to decline the trade of pawns by pushing his pawn, and then you push your pawn to c5. If you were to push d5 without going c6, like a Scandinavian, then white would probably happily take to make black's queen come out to d5 and be vulnerable to moves like knight c3, so white gets free development. But here what we do is it's not really a bait, but you want the pawn to come forward to e5 so that you can play c5 to go after the d4 pawn to try and undermine the e5 square. Hopefully that makes sense. Obviously, there are so many different branches of the Caro Kann, but on a purely like fundamental level, I suppose, that's what you're trying to do here. So white, of course, defends his center. You don't have to do that. White can take. White can also go knight to f3 to defend the pawn. White can go knight to e2 to defend the pawn. I've even seen people play moves like f4 in this position, just kind of going for this trade, allowing moves like knight c6, but trying to hang on to the e5 pawn with the f4 pawn. But my opponent plays it like this, with knight f3, and I do believe that taking is the best move here, because if knight takes, then white loses the pawn on e5, which we had a similar line in the last game, actually. No, it wasn't this exact line. It wasn't this exact line, but we had a similar-ish line. But taking is good for black, because you force c takes d4. Of course, the queen can't take because that's hanging a queen. And if knight takes, then the knight takes its eyes off of the e5 pawn. Again, the e5 pawn can be quite weak in these positions, which means that after c takes d4, c takes d4, the d4 pawn is quite the target, and bishop g4, I think it's the correct move, but it makes sense. You immediately pin the knight to the queen, and the knight is obviously a defender of the d4 pawn, which basically increases the pressure. Queen b6 is a very tempting move here, just to go after the d4 pawn. e6 is probably also a perfectly fine move. If queen b6, I would expect... Oh wait, no, that doesn't work. if bishop e3, then you just lose this pawn. Although there are lines with knight b to d2 where white just sacks the b2 pawn and tries to play moves like rook to b1. And honestly, I don't like those lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to play this in a very simple way. We're going to go e6, and we're going to go knight probably to e7, and most likely to f5 to apply pressure to the pawn that way. If, in this opening, this happens all the time, if white goes h3, you take. You do not try and keep this bishop on the board. The bishop goes out to g4 to die. That is its purpose, because you lock the pawn chain with the move e6, creating this barrier in the center of the board, which is kind of the whole point of the Caro Kann, but different to the French defense is you get the bishop outside of the pawn chain first. You can bring the bishop out to f5. That is perfectly valid. There are reasons that I don't like doing that personally, but it's a perfectly valid opening, and it's maybe a bit easier to learn on a beginner level. But I like inducing the move knight to f3 so that I can go bishop to g4 to apply pressure to the knight, and by proxy apply pressure to the dark squares, which means that even though I have a light squared bishop, I'm technically applying pressure to a dark square, which I think is quite a nice concept. I'm going to go knight g to e7 here, with the intention of going knight to f5. My opponent goes knight c3. That actually feels a little bit off. I feel like the knight should be going to d2, but okay, let's go knight f5. Now this is a threat. Now this is absolutely a threat. And bishop to e3 does defend the threat, but the bishop is under a lot of pressure. We can take it at any point. If bishop e3, even a move like bishop e7 preparing to castle looks pretty comfortable. We don't have any immediate knockout, and you could argue that a few moves ago here, no, not here, here, maybe I should have gone queen to b6. We'll see what the computer thinks of it, but there will be some situations where the computer encourages a move like queen b6 to go pawn grabbing after a move like bishop to e3. And from a computer perspective, it will say, oh, the position is equal, black is up a pawn, but white has activity as compensation. But on a practical level, I don't really want to play a position where I'm a pawn down and the computer still gives an equal position because of white's activity. To me, that is a really bad sign, because that's a whole point's worth of activity. Because white is down a pawn, yet the computer says it's equal, which means that white's extra activity is worth a whole point of material. To me, I find that quite scary, and I play a lot of lines with the white pieces, Gambit style like that, where I give up a pawn, but the computer says it's equal or slightly better for white, which essentially means I've got a whole point or more worth of activity, which I think is, to me, way easier to play than being up the material. Depends on the position, of course. Bishop to f4 looks like a complete blunder, because I just take. I don't really understand where white's counterplay is there. I'm taking with this knight, because if I take with the c knight, I'm probably fine, but I don't like the idea of opening up this diagonal. That's all. It's, like I say, it's probably fine, but I prefer to take with the f knight. Also because this knight applies pressure to e5, so also worth bearing in mind. We are putting pressure on the bishop, we're a whole pawn up, and white has no obvious counterplay. We have a strong pawn chain in the center, which nullifies these two minor pieces. Now we do need to watch out for any potential sacrifices on d5, which could happen, maybe, with these three pieces linking up, but it's very unlikely to be actually dangerous, because our king is quite safe. The next two moves, if white does nothing, are going to be bishop to e7, there, e7, and castle kingside. And then other useful moves are moves like a6, controlling the b5 square. And moves like rook c8 are good to get on this open file. Moves like queen b6 can be good to get on this active diagonal and target the weak b2 pawn. Bishop g5 is... sorry, g4. I don't think white is actually trying to target e6. I think he's simply trying to step out of the way of the knight, which to me seems like a complete waste of a move. Normally, you do want to avoid a bishop for knight trade, but in this position, my knight is so much more active than this bishop that if I was white, it wouldn't be silly to try to encourage this knight to take and have queen takes, because this knight is so damn strong. Bishop g4, I don't think really accomplishes anything. There is a case to be made for h5, and after bishop h5, queen h4, attacking both bishops and putting pressure on h2, which is currently defended by the bishop. But that looks really, really strong, the move h5. And if the bishop retreats, then we just have an active pawn and we can potentially push it to h4 and maybe even h3. And if white goes bishop to h3, then I think g5 attacking this bishop followed by g4 just wins the bishop. So I'm going to go h5. And at the end of the day, if white takes here, and after queen to h4, white plays a move like g4, which holds on to the bishop and blocks the queen's attack on the other bishop, white can keep the pawn, which would put us on equal material because, of course, we just won the d4 pawn. But I don't really care. I'm sacrificing one pawn. I heard Daniel Naroditsky talked about this in a recent YouTube video of his. I absolutely love Danya, and I model my channel in many ways off of Danya's own content, but I try to cater to a lower rated audience because of course I am lower rated than Danya. I feel like Danya being, like 2700 is very good for like 1600 to 2200-ish. For me, I'm rated just over 2000, so I try to cater for like 1000 to 1500 sort of rating range. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, he talked about in a recent video that sacrificing a pawn, it really isn't very big, a very big deal. Like, it is just a pawn at the end of the day. My opponent takes. We're going to go queen to h4. It wouldn't surprise me if my opponent plays pawn g3 or bishop g3 because they just get scared of the checkmate threat. But even if I don't win this pawn back, even if g4 gets played and I don't win the pawn back, or even bishop g4, the bishop is defended and blocks my attack on this bishop, it doesn't really matter. I really don't care. It's a single pawn, and I was already up a pawn anyway, so who cares? I have a lot of pressure, which is what I'm far more interested in. Knight to f5 is an interesting move. Stopping bishop g3 because I'll take and then go to h2. And if bishop takes, then I can take this bishop, and the f4 bishop is under attack, and I'm threatening mate. So that's a very nice idea, because bishop g3 could be annoying. If bishop takes, of course, you don't want to take back, because you ruin your pawn structure, and after bishop g3 attacking your queen and defending h2, the d5 pawn is going to fall, and your king is very, very weak in that position. So, yeah, knight f5 looks like a very interesting idea. g5, I don't think achieves anything. We just get our queen attacked, so that is pointless. Knight f5, I think, is a pretty good move. If knight f5, pawn g3, then the bishop no longer defends the h2 square. And, of course, if the bishop takes, we take the bishop. After knight to f5, though, the difference is we are then threatening the move g5, because if bishop g3, we're going to take, and then h2 is undefended. So I'm going to do it. I think this is a decent move. Again, I'm not really calculating the entire attack out here, because I just feel like the pressure is too much for white to deal with. And white immediately blunders with the move g3, which I didn't predict, but I pointed out. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because, yeah, my opponent resigns in this position, which is absolutely fair enough, because you're about to get mated. That's a very interesting game. Playing the Caro Kann in a more aggressive style, winning in 15 moves. What we're going to do is, because this game was a bit shorter, I'll do a quick analysis of it, and then we're going to play a second game. So we'll have two games in one video. I will timestamp everything below, so if you do want to jump to the second game, that's fine. I would encourage you to watch the analysis because it is going to be like not brief to the point that it's not useful, but not over the top. So let's get into the analysis. Lads, Game Review reckons that that is a 95% accuracy Caro Kann. That is unreal. Unreal. Okay, so let's see what it thinks. Let's turn these silly notations off. D4, D5. I've explained the Caro Kann so many times. Again, I have got to have a whole playlist dedicated to the opening. E5. Like I said, Bishop F5 is the main line. I'm not a fan of it, mainly because of this variation with H4, known as the Tal variation. I find it very, very difficult with the black pieces. Especially, there's some really tough lines, if I can remember correctly. I think it's H6, G4, Bishop here, and E6. This I actually used to play with the white pieces as well. This is crushing. In my mind, this is completely crushing for the white pieces. It is playable with black, but I don't see why you would ever want to do it. We don't go into all that stuff though. I go C5, my opponent goes C3, and we go knight to C6, applying more pressure. Bishop B5 is the best move here. Even bishop to E2, and if takes, white is apparently fine. But my opponent chooses knight to F3, which immediately gives the advantage to black, very, very slightly. But CD4, CD4, bishop G4, black is slightly better because there's a lot of pressure here, and the black position is very comfortable. Bishop to E2 is played. E6, that is the best move, so I'm very happy about that. The computer does like this idea of queen to B6, but I was concerned firstly about bishop to E3 because I felt like queen B2, knight BD2 was very, very scary. And yeah, the computer literally just changed its mind as I played a few moves out and gives the white pieces plus 0.62, which means that white has plus 1.62 materials worth of activity because white is a pawn down. Ain't no way I'm playing that. No chance. We instead go for E6. You don't need to do anything crazy in the Caro Kann. It's a very solid opening. My opponent castles, knight G to E7, trying to get to F5. This opening kind of plays itself sometimes. I think it really does. Because it's obvious. You want to put pressure on the D4 pawn because it's weak. Knight C3, knight F5. We go after the pawn. The best move here for white, I don't think you'll ever find it. It's knight to E1. What? And after bishop E2, knight E2, white defends the d-pawn. No one is ever playing that. Bishop to E3 looks far more natural to me. And yeah, the computer agrees with what I was saying. Bishop to E7, H3 you take every single time when provoked. Castling is completely fine. Bishop G5 is an interesting move to try and get rid of this bishop from the defense of the center. But my opponent doesn't do any of that. He goes bishop to F4, which is just a blunder. I think it should be given a blunder, not an inaccuracy, because bishop F3, knight FD4, and white is in trouble. Now, bishop G4 is actually the best move. So, fair play to my opponent for finding that, because I did not even consider the move. If a move like rook C1, which looks rather natural, just bishop E7, which is what I was going to play, and let's say rook E1, it wants to go for this bishop G5 move again. Very interesting. Trying to get rid of this bishop, and I assume put more pressure on the E5 square. So that's an interesting thing to watch out for, this bishop G5 idea to try and undermine the bishop from controlling either of the central pawns. But my opponent finds the best move. I go H5. The computer doesn't love it, but after bishop takes H5, this is its only gripe. This queen to H4 move. Oh, G4 doesn't even work anyway because of, well, I was going to say this, and this, but just g6 traps the bishop. So, okay. I hope I would have found that if it had actually been played. But bishop g4, best move for my opponent. And the position is equal, but it's so tough for my opponent to play. I go knight to f5, which I think is a really interesting move, just stopping bishop to g3 ideas. And if white plays one bad move, like rook c1, then g5, the computer agrees, is really bad news. And the computer wants to do this, and after this, bishop to h3, bishop g7, and white is kind of just hanging on for his life here. A move like queen f3 gets immediately punished, and there's no way to defend the c5 pawn. The knight is probably going to come in. I'd assume the king will walk over to the king side and hide away, but this is very, very tough. After bishop g4, knight to f5, of course, setting up these ideas of attacking. My opponent just gives me checkmate on the spot, so very generous of my opponent. He realized before I actually played the move and resigned anyway. But an interesting game nonetheless. Hopefully that highlights just how easy the Caro Kann can be sometimes. But let's get into the second game. Okay, so we have the white pieces against ACH Chess from, I think that's Venezuela? Yeah, I've got some pretty good geography. And we have a Vienna, so my two favorite openings, the Caro Kann for black and the Vienna for white in the same video. This is absolutely vintage Chess Centurion stuff. And we get a Vienna Gambit, so absolute bread and butter. I learned this in a Gotham chess course, I think a few years ago at this point, and it's served me very well ever since. I've added my own, like, twists to the opening. I don't play it quite in the way recommended by Levy in every single line, but the foundation of it on that course is genuinely brilliant. I really can't criticize it very much at all, if at all. But yeah, I have a whole playlist on my channel dedicated to games that I've played in the Vienna, similar to the Caro Kann, so that will be linked below if you're interested. But this is so tough for black. There's so many ways to go wrong. But bishop b4, that's an interesting one. I actually don't know the correct line here. Okay, well the obvious move is taking. That's the obvious move. So what happens if I take? Well, I assume black takes here, because if you're just going to retreat the knight to g8, then why did you play bishop to b4? I assume bishop b4 is intended to do this. And then if I take with the b pawn, let's say, knight to e4. But then I think queen g4 might cause problems for black, because the knight is under attack and g7 is under attack, and I stop queen to h4 check. So takes. There is a case to be made for taking with the d pawn, actually, to open up this bishop. There is definitely a case to be made. Although this bishop will probably come to h6 if queen takes g7 and rook to f8 to put pressure on the rook. But if I take with the b pawn and we get a same scenario where the queen takes on g7 and the rook goes to f8, then I always have bishop to a3, and because this pawn will be on e5, d6 won't be good enough to stop it because I can take, and if c takes, then the d6 pawn will be weak forever. And then I will get d4 in and have a really strong center. So it's all worth bearing in mind. I think the critical line is probably taking. Probably. Knight d5 is worth noting because you attack the bishop. But just knight takes, pawn takes, and that looks pretty damn good for black. So that seems a bit silly for white to do. I think I have to take. I'm sure I've got to take. So we'll see what black does. Yeah, okay, he takes on c3. Now, do I take? Do I take with the d pawn? I'm leaning more and more towards yes. because my thinking is that this bishop will get much better development out this way. And yes, these pawns will be weak in the center, but I don't think that matters anymore. I think what's important in this game now, and I am going to take with a d pawn, I think what's important is the weakness of black's king. And I think queen g4 is an issue for black, because let's say d5 is played, opening up an attack on my queen and defending the knight. So queen g4, d5. I think I can get away with queen takes g7, attacking the rook, because queen to h4 can be met with g3, and my queen defends this square. So knight g3, I just play queen g3. And if queen e4 check, and knight e2 and queen h1, very tricky stuff. Actually, no, I don't do that. If queen g4, d5, queen g7, queen h4, g3, knight takes, queen e4, I have bishop e2. And if queen h1, I have bishop to f3, trapping the queen. This is some high-level calculation, I think, for the majority of people watching. But this is why these kinds of sidelines, sometimes in the opening that my opponent is playing, are so difficult to handle. Because I've just had to calculate like 8 moves in the future to make sure that I'm not getting mated or just losing a rook, right? That's tough to do, and it's tough to have the confidence to do that. But something worth noting is that I've been playing the Vienna for a long, long time, for years, which tells me 2 things. One, it tells me that this bishop b4 move is bad, because I've never seen it. I've never seen this move, which tells me there's something wrong with it, because if I haven't seen it, it means it's not good. Right? I would have either seen it in analysis, or I would have seen it in at least one game. I have never seen that. So immediately I'm like, okay, something is wrong with that move, and I need to figure out what. And I think this is the issue with it, because I can take on g7 and I'm good. I think I'm good. Yeah, let's take. Let's take the leap of faith. Hopefully my 1000 rated opponent doesn't completely obliterate me here. It does take a little bit of courage, but that line with here, 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 here works. And yes, my opponent proves me right. He goes rook to f8, which tells me that I am correct. It tells me I'm correct. Bishop h6. I don't know if that's a good move, actually. Because, okay, black kind of has to play knight to d7. Because if here and the queen defends, then I'm just going to exchange everything and be up a rook for a bishop. So bishop to h6, knight d7 defending does block this bishop from developing, which is great. I could just castle queenside. And black has nothing. Yeah, let's do it. This, I don't think is concerning, because black can never try anything. I was thinking, oh, maybe there's issues with knight taking, and then queen takes, and then the queen taking the bishop. But I don't think so. Yeah, and black goes for queen e7, which tells me that he didn't actually know the opening, I don't think. I think he was playing purely off of gut instinct, and that we are completely winning here. Now, we should hesitate a second before taking this rook, because technically there is no rush. We could just go knight to f3 here. Although, no, because then knight to d7 can be played defending the rook. So, no, we're going to cash in. We're going to cash in immediately. Go our exchange up. The only thing we need to watch out for is not castling too soon. We don't want to castle too soon and allow knight to f2, forking the rooks. That would be that would be very bad. I think bishop to d3, just attacking this knight, is the easiest way to go about this position, because I will happily take this knight and get rid of any ideas black has and just castle. Can we castle now anyway? Because if knight to f2, bishop f5, that's a free bishop. And if knight takes d1, then king takes, that's 2 pieces for a rook, and we're already up in exchange. So that's just a free knight. We're up a whole knight. If castle, knight f2, bishop takes, knight h1, knight h3, we block this knight's escape square, attack it with the rook, and we get 2 pieces for the rook. So yeah, let's castle. Let's castle. My only concern with taking was bishop takes, and c2 is under attack, and g2 is under attack, and my rook could get trapped. But this works perfectly. After knight takes, we go knight to h2, we win this knight back. Sorry, knight to h3, we win the knight back, and we are up a whole piece. This is why calculation is so, so important in chess. All I've done this game, really, is play, three moves of theory, got lost here, and then calculated. I just calculated, played normal moves, and now we're in a completely winning position, which is fantastic. My opponent goes c6. Let's just take. I mean, technically the knight was going nowhere, and you could argue that you could take on h7, but why overcomplicate things when you're already completely winning? That is unnecessary. I mean, yeah, black doesn't really have anything. Let's defend the pawn. I'd like to play bishop to f5 and e6 to try and open things up. Rook h8 isn't really a concern because our knight blocks everything on the h-file. And yeah, I want to play this e6 move because we'll be attacking the knight and the pawn, meaning that even if black doesn't take us, we are going to take on f7 when the knight moves and forcibly open up the position because we are up a whole piece and 2 extra pawns. And if this f-pawn comes off the board, we have connected passes, which are going to be basically unstoppable, which would be great news, obviously. Yeah, I think, a pretty simple way to get the advantage, but the game isn't over yet. We still have some work to do here, because I know for certain that a certain amount of you watching would find a way to mess this up somehow. But you don't want to be too hasty here. You're up a lot of material, but one, you don't want to do something silly and lose a piece. You don't want to allow this knight to somehow fork like your rook and your king, or your rook and your bishop or something. And black, let's say rook to g8 gets played. You could allow the rook in for no reason and allow black more counterplay than he should get. This is a decent move, knight to c5. Black is controlling the e6 square, making this difficult. b4 is worth noticing because black can't come to e4. He will get taken. If he goes to e6, I will take him. And if b4, knight to a4, c3 is under attack. But maybe I don't care about c3. Maybe I just push. But then f6. Maybe I can bring my knight in. It's a decent move, though. It's a decent move. There's maybe a case to be made for c4, but I don't think that's worth doing. Really? I'm tempted to go king to d2, actually. Just bring my king, because then if b4, knight to a4, then my king defends the c3 square, which I think is useful. I think that's quite useful. Let's see what my opponent does. Okay, b5. I think that helps us, actually. Now I'm going to go b4. He might be trying to route his knight to the c4 square by clamping down on it like this, but that's no concern, because I will always happily give my bishop up for the active knight. e6, I think, is a no-brainer. If black takes, then he's going to lose the game after rook to e6. And if he goes f6, declining the trade, then I don't really want to move my knight just yet because of h2. Although, actually, no, that doesn't matter because I just give this check, and then the king has to move, and then I push the pawn, and then I've got bishop d7 check, forcing the king off of the e8 square, and then I can promote. So I actually don't care about this pawn. This knight I've stranded to the edge of the board. And yeah, it can try and get itself back into the game, sure. But do I want to give this check? Yeah, let's give this check. Let's do it. And then probably just bishop d3. I think let's just play this very simply. If you want to take me, please be my guest. If you want to give me a check, I will happily take you. And I will be up my knight and 2 pawns. Very happily. No issues at all. Don't overcomplicate these winning positions. I think a lot of people are very guilty of doing that, and I definitely used to be. Let's go knight to f4, defending g2, and looking at these interesting light squares, potentially allowing my rook to get in. This knight is a bit loose, but it doesn't matter because a move like rook to g4 can be met with g3. We create a nice pawn chain defending my knight. And there's really no concerns. This knight isn't doing anything. My bishop is monitoring this knight very nicely. Yeah, let's just play g3. Don't do anything fancy. And see what my opponent comes up with. Realistically, he literally just blunders immediately. Rook e6 picks up the c6 pawn. And then b5 is hanging. And d5 is hanging. That looks pretty damn good to me. I wouldn't be surprised if my opponent goes king to g5 actually and gets himself mated. I would not be surprised at all. Let's see what he does. Let's see what he does. Tell you what, if he does go king g5, you have to like the video. I think that is a very, very fair deal since I am playing this live. Oh, he doesn't do it. Okay, well, you should probably like the video anyway, because I think it's been a very decent video. But let's take on c6. I have more than enough pieces here to defend, and my opponent gives me a rook in 3 different ways. Let's take with the bishop, just because the checking sound effect is quite satisfying, and my opponent resigns here. A very comfortable game, to be honest. Let's go through some analysis of this now. If you don't want to stick around for the analysis, absolutely fine. I would recommend checking out the previous episodes of the speedrun, linked down in the playlist below, but I would encourage you to stick around for the analysis. So let's get into that now. Well, I thought the previous game with 95% accuracy was pretty nice, but this one had 95.7. So I'm really happy that I found the correct way out of the opening. So let's get into it. e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4. The best continuation for black is d5, and lines tend to go like this. You can go knight f3 here with white, you can go queen to f3. You can take on e4, but I mean, it's not great really. Only black can be better here. But my opponent doesn't go for any of that. He goes for bishop to b4, and it's a blunder. The computer thinks the game is basically over. I don't know that though. I have no idea. I've never seen this move before. But like I said, because I've never seen this move before, I'm like, there's got to be something wrong with it. So I calculate some long variations, and I trust my calculation. I spent about 2 minutes, because I'm like, I can't do anything but take on e5. And here, black has to take on c3, because if he retreats his knight, then why did he put the bishop there? What's the point of it? It's useless. Because you would think the point of it is to remove the knight, like he did, so that the knight no longer defends the e4 pawn. Apparently taking with the b pawn was actually better, and if this line that we got in the game happens with rook to f8, the computer wanted to go d3. So keep the d pawn on the d file so that d3 can be played, and when the knight retreats, just develop normally, I suppose. But dc3 I liked, because we open up the bishop, and it made my calculation very easy after queen to g4, which is the only real good move in the position, because you can't stop this double attack. You can't stop it. And yeah, my opponent goes d5, defending the knight, attacking the queen. Makes a lot of sense. Queen g7. Now, the line I was calculating was queen h4, g3, knight g3. Now, I could always take this rook, in fairness. Okay, well, here I would have queen to f6. So what about king d7? And you could get into some interesting lines if the queen takes here or gives this check. And I didn't really want to have to calculate that. So I was basically checking to see if after queen h4 check, I could get away with queen takes g3. Because after queen e4 check, I realized that blocking with the bishop meant that if the queen takes here, I have queen to f3, and the queen is trapped. Which, once I saw that variation, I was then more than happy to go for this f takes e5 line and just go right into the deep end. That was the one variation I wanted to check. And it works. So my opponent goes d5, queen g7, and goes rook to f8. Hilariously, the computer likes to move king e7, which is very silly looking. Rook f8, I just go bishop to h6. I didn't see a need to overcomplicate things. If queen h4, g3, I did consider what if my opponent does this, but then I can just take on f8. That's not really a concern because I was like, well, maybe my opponent wants to do this and deflect my queen, which would equalize the game for black. But queen takes f8 exists in all of those lines. So I was expecting my opponent to play knight to d7 defending here. And I think the best that I can really do is just develop castle queenside. Don't do anything silly. Basically, knight f3 stopping the queen from getting to h4. And it's just a comfortable game for white up a pawn and with a lot of activity. And black is very, very cramped. So cramped that white gets a plus 3.9 advantage. But queen e7 is played, and I play the best move of taking on f8 because I don't see the point in overcomplicating things. Knight f3, knight d7, now I can't take. I'm still much better, but why make it more difficult? Just exchange everything. And I was very happy with this bishop to d3 move, attacking the knight, and after bishop to f5, castling. Because it might not be the best move, but it baits knight to f2, which is so hard to resist. Like, who doesn't want to play this awesome looking fork? It doesn't work though, because of knight to h3. And the knight has no escape. We take on h1. Like I said, you could make a case for taking on h7, but don't overcomplicate things. Just take the knight. We're up so much material as it is. And then the end game. Oh, king d2 was actually the best move. Interesting. Yeah, we kick the knight to the edge of the board, go e6, trying to open things up. Take on f7, bishop d3. The computer likes that because don't allow your opponent to get activity unnecessarily, especially when you're up so much material. Rook g8, knight f4, rook g4, g3. Very, very solid. Give the check on e6, take the pawn, and here my opponent just gives me a rook and resigns in this position. Again, the opening was difficult, but trust your instinct, trust your preparation. If you prepare your openings properly, you should have a good idea of what works and what doesn't work. And if there's something you haven't seen before in an opening that you've been playing for a long time and have studied quite in depth, don't just trust your opponent. Don't trust them. Challenge what they're doing and really think about it. Because if you haven't seen that before, it either means that your opponent is doing something wrong or you haven't prepared properly, right? Because if your opponent's playing a good move that you haven't seen before, then your preparation probably hasn't been quite up to par. And don't get me wrong, that's happened to me loads of times in the past. But in this case, it felt wrong. And chess, there's a lot of calculation that goes into it, but there's also a lot of gut instinct. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and the double game special, I suppose. Thank you very much for watching. Drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel and my motivation. And check out the video here that YouTube is recommending to you because it thinks you're really going to enjoy it.